क्वेश्चन नंबर 1 में कोई प्रॉब्लम, इसमें जो पूछा गया है इसमें कोई प्रॉब्लम है किसी को? इट इज सिंपल दैट हियर व्हाट यू हैव टू डू, इट इज कीवर्ड हियर इज मोर ह्यूमनिस्टिक. So you should know both the concepts, Marx and Marx view, one, and second is you should also know the conception of humanism. What is essentially humanism? Okay, and the clearly here more means comparative. So in this question, what you had to do, you had to show essentially that Marx's view is, can I say it would be more humanistic than Malthus? But a secondary keyword I find is comment. And comment is something where you have been given a little bit more freedom to take a stand. So, can I also take a stand where I can say that Marx's view is more humanistic than Malthus, although less than demographic transition theory? सीधी सी बात है, ठीक है? So definitely what you'll do, you'll compare it from both the perspectives. Okay. Coming to question number 7, I'll give you 2 minutes. Frame your answers. So the question says Malthus and Marx seem to be simultaneously closer as well as apart. Comment. So if we talk about this question, there can be two ways of writing this. One is the more simpler way, and in the more simpler way, what you'll do, you will essentially simply write about, as the question itself you can see is more with respect to, it says that Malthus and Marx seem to be simultaneously closer as well as apart. Okay, so they are closer as well as apart. So tell me, here does the term closer tells me that the similarities and apart is clearly the difference. Okay. So one way of writing it is that I can start with an introduction. And what can be written as an introduction? Can we say that since both Malthus and Marx dwelled upon the population resource relationship and its problems, although with different philosophical backgrounds, thus there emerges lots of similarities and differences. तो एक छोटा सा introduction, it can be very, very powerful introduction. So we can say that both Malthus and Marx analyzed the population resource relationship and its related problems, although with totally opposite, or you can use a more milder word, different philosophical backgrounds. Thus there emerges several similarities and differences. ठीक है? So from here, in this simple way of writing, what will happen when you are writing the main body? In the main body, simply you will put a heading of the differences. पहले differences लिखो. and then you will write the similarities, differences and similarities between them. ठीक है, तो आई नो दैट ये पार्ट सबने पढ़ा होता है, differences and similarities, but फिर भी like for example Marx, if you talk about, criticized a lot Malthus, and a number of bases of criticisms were there, and thus emerges several differences also in the theories. Like for example, one difference you can talk about with respect to the Malthus was using biological determinism. Biological determinism. On the other hand, if you talk about Marx theory कौन सी थी? It was historical materialism. So we can call it, it was also a kind of determinism, because हम देखेंगे perspective में that determinism is what type of philosophy? Determinism is a philosophy where essentially what happens, there is absence of free will. That means the laws are already present. Okay, there is already a cause, and what will happen? The events will follow because of that cause. That is essentially determinism. So, one form of determinism is environmental determinism. But can I say the same thing can happen because of other forms of determinism? Like we later see there can be cultural determinism, there can be economic determinism. Okay, so Marx's view is referred to as aspect of economic determinism. ठीक है, there is economic determinism. So that is one thing, and other aspects, like for example, second very important difference between them was with respect to the case of natural law of population. So if you have studied the concept, the topic of population theories, you know there are two type of population theories जो हम पढ़ते हैं, natural law theories and दूसरी कौन सी है, socio economic theories. ठीक है, so there are two category of theories. Malthusian theory forms under the category of natural law theories, while if you talk about the Marxian theory, it falls under the category of socio-economic theories. ठीक है, so that was another difference. Other differences, like for example, they differed in terms of concept of overpopulation. If you talk about both, we'll see that both of them are agreeing that there is overpopulation, the problem exists. But why this overpopulation exists and what are the consequences of this overpopulation, there is a difference between them. Okay? So overpopulation, if you talk about with respect to Malthus, what he says about overpopulation, that it is essentially inevitable that there will be overpopulation. Inevitable that there will be overpopulation. Marx says that it is not inevitable, but it is function of what? It is function of the production system used. Okay, so he is more saying that it is function of production system used. So, for example, he says that in communist production system there is no such case of overpopulation. Okay. Similarly, if you talk about there was other things, like for example, uh, existence of misery. So with respect to misery, what was Malthus idea? He's talked about that it being natural and necessary, or we can say it was necessary, and this misery also was treated by Malthus as what? As a check on population growth. You know the positive checks. So it was treated as a check on population growth. Then, if you talk about, on the other hand, for Marx, it was very different. That misery, if you talk about, it was not natural. It was outcome of capitalist production system. Capitalist production system. And When it comes to the check on population growth, he was very clear that misery does what? It magnifies the problem of population growth. As misery increases, the inequality increases and the population growth keep on increasing. Okay? So that is another difference between them. And there are differences, for example, with respect to technology के respect में there are differences between them. So, for example, Malthus also little bit takes into account the factor of technology, that there will be increase in production. He talks about that there will be increase in production, but inevitably what will happen? There will be, if you talk about population will grow much more, it will grow geometrically. So basically in this, he is assuming that there is a limit. Okay, there is essentially a limit of any growth, and in a way what he is assuming is that there is law of diminishing return. Uski puri theory jo based hai, it is based upon the law of diminishing return. So you know what is law of diminishing return? In law of diminishing returns, what happens? You keep on, if you keep on putting inputs, the output would increase, but essentially it would be there will be a threshold point. Beyond that, what will happen? The same returns won't be achieved, and there will be marginal output which will be achieved. It will keep on declining. So his theory, Malthusian theory, is essentially an example of law of diminishing returns. So he essentially believes that technology has a limited role to play. He has less faith in technology. On the other hand, if you talk about Marx, Marx's view on technology are very different. Marx has more faith in technology than Malthus. He has clearly more faith in technology, and he believes that technology can keep on producing subsistence, can keep on producing subsistence. Now, however, what he believes that the use of technology is, again, technology is essentially a tool, and it will be utilized according to the production system. So in capitalism, what happens? The use of technology is for exploitation of the labor or the poor. And thus what happens? The problem arises. But if you talk about in the communist system, technology is essentially used for the welfare of all. ठीक है. So there are several differences between them. और भी हम बात कर सकते थे. मिजरी पे हमने बात कर लिया. मेन ये सारे पॉइंट्स जो हम डिफरेंसेस में लिखते हैं. और भी लिख सकते थे, like we didn't talk about the philosophical background of both of them. So one was approaching from the capitalism point of view, and the other was from the communist point of view. Other differences, like for example, there was difference in the view with respect to the problem of misery inequality. For Malthus, it was more spatial. It was more spatial. For Marx, it was more temporal. ठीक है. सो दोनों में डिफरेंस है. ये पॉइंट जो मैंने लिखा है, ये यहां पर एक्चुअली कंटेन्ड है. सो इसलिए मैंने नहीं लिखवाया था, बट अलग से बता देता हूं, बिकॉज द टर्म कैन बी यूज्ड. सो हाउ इन मार्क्स माल्थस इट वाज स्पेशल. सिंपल सी बात है कि सपोज करो वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट अ desert, and we are talking about a fertile plain. So tell me, can I say the carrying capacity in a desert will be low, and in a fertile plain the carrying capacity will be high? So tell me where the problem of this positive checks would arrive first. It would be in the desert. So for Malthus, the problem was more spatial in nature, which is contained in this idea when we are saying it is given or natural. So in a way, he was doing what? He was defending the idea of capitalism. On the other hand, for Marx, it was different. Marx के लिए, as we have seen before also, what essentially happens, the society in historical materialism, he sees that in Europe, the society started from a form of primitive communism when there was more equality. But then came the, in fact, इस तरह से बना दो, then came the feudalism. And feudal landlords were given ownership of land. So what happened? The inequality began to rise. And with time, this inequality continued to rise. Ultimately, what happened? These same feudal landlords became the capitalists because they had money as technological growth took place after the Renaissance. So there was rise of capitalism and inequality. In capitalism also there were phases. For example, initially there was mercantile capitalism, then came the industrial capitalism. Okay, so there have been phases. So what happens? It continues to grow. Ultimately, he believes that the masses will be fed up one day and there will be a revolution. And with revolution, ultimately what will happen? A equality based system will be produced, which he called it as communism, community based system where there is equality. Okay? So you can see, for Malthus, can we say inequality would be varying according to space? Different areas have different carrying capacity. For example, take the case of United States of America. So in US, the population base is this. Sorry, resource base is this and population is this. Okay? If you compare this with India, can we say this is the relationship? Okay? So very clearly inequality will be higher where? Here in this space. So that is what Malthus is talking about. But for Marx, it depends upon the stage of growth which is taking place. So when there was feudalism, still there was less inequality. With capitalism, what is happening? The inequality is further increasing. And you can cite the reports. For example, every year we see that inequality has further increased. So that was the basic idea. It is more time dependent. In case of Malthus, it is space dependent. Okay? So like this, there are several differences you can write. Similarly, similarities में अगर हम आए, so there are several similarities आती हैं. So like in case of similarities, both, if you talk about, they identify a kind of industrial reserve army. Reserve army. दोनों आइडेंटिफाई करते हैं. In case of Marx, it is explicit. In case of Malthus, it is implicit. ठीक है, क्योंकि माल्थस भी ओवर पॉपुलेशन की बात कर रहा है, अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट की बात कर रहा है. So essentially he is also talking about what? There will be people who will not get employment. And that is essentially what? That is an industrial reserve army. So both of them talk about this issue. Then if you talk about the idea of geometrical growth of population, can we say both of them are agreeing to this idea? Here Malthus is very explicitly agreeing that there is geometric growth of population, but when it comes to Marx, he is not explicit, but he doesn't deny the idea of geometric growth of population. Okay, so when he is saying that because of inequality people will be keep on accumulating labor, that means in the labor class what will happen, the population growth will keep on taking place. So inevitably he is agreeing that a very fast growth of population is taking place. Okay. Similarly, if you talk about another difference is the in similarity, in fact, innate passion between the sexes. So both of them, in case of Malthus, it is explicit, but in case of Marx, it is implicit. He implicitly agrees that there will be population growth fast taking place. And if you talk about both of them, in some way, they agree with respect to socio-economic checks on population. Both of them are agreeing on this. So, you know that in case of Malthus, he talks about which type of socio-economic checks on population? He talks about mainly moral restraint. He emphasizes the case of moral restraint. But tell me, can I say that Marx also emphasizes, or not emphasizes, it is in his writings, that he is more concerned with the socio economic restraints. As people will have more employment, and essentially with more employment will come more responsibility, and essentially it will be a restraint. So tell me, can we say both of them are socio-economic in nature? Either it is moral restraint or the socio-economic restraint, both of them are moral in nature. Okay? And if you talk about then another thing is both of them have agreed on the role of technology. Role of technology. दोनों agree करते हैं. That Malthus also says that technology will increase production. He doesn't denies this. He also agrees that technology will increase production. Marx is very clearly saying that it will keep on increasing production. So it is more explicitly positively taken in case of Marx. In Malthus, there is limit to technology. There is limit to growth. So there emerges a little difference. So देखो एक तरीका तो ये है लिखने का कि हमने बहुत सारे differences और similarities लिख दी. एक तरीका ये है, there can be other way of writing this main body. ठीक है? Where what we are essentially doing is we are combining both the things, the similarities and the differences. So on what aspects they are essentially agreeing and how the difference emerges, जैसे हमने अपना introduction बनाया है. ठीक है? So if we write it in this way, then what will happen? It will be very in line with what we have written in the introduction. ठीक है? So like for example, अब एक एक करके points लिखते हैं. Both, can we say both of them were in favor of progress? Both, if you look into Malthus and Marx, they were in favor of progress. However, what is the difference which emerges in them? If you talk about Malthus, this progress was more of a kind of status quo. It was more about status quo. Okay. So he was more in favor of what? A kind of evolutionary development. Evolutionary development. That means he was very clear. You don't need to change capitalism. You don't need to change the market-based system. The market-based system would evolve and that would solve the problem. And if you talk about how this can be achieved, this evolutionary development, one way was the idea of population control. We already talked in the previous class about the policy. So definitely it was there will be population control. If you compare it with Marx, on the other hand, Marx favored revolution. Marx essentially favored revolution. And for him, the social progress was revolutionary movement. Social progress was a revolutionary movement. Revolutionary movement where progress is from one stage to other, one system to other. From one system to other. ठीक है? So entire system is changing. There is no use of the same capitalistic or the market oriented system. The entire system changes. ठीक है? So that is one. Both of them, if you look into another इसी तरह का है, both of them were of pro utilitarian view. They had a pro utilitarian view. But again, for Malthus, it was anti revolutionary in nature, where he tried to preserve, where a system was where there was preserving of private property and private enterprise. Malthus believes that revolutions, what they do, they cause greater misery than which already existed. Okay. So you see, actually, in a way, many cases are there where it has happened. And there were the cases in India में भी हमने देखा था कि लोग बहुत परेशान थे 2000 उससे पहले देखें 2014 से पहले about corruption and everything. Then a revolution happened. And now you can see that what kind of misery is there. And clearly, in case of Marx, Marx, he believed that pro-utilitarian was revolutionary in nature. Revolutionary in nature. So he consciously recognized that tyranny and exploitation should be overthrown and eradicated. Eradicated. Private property should be private property should be used to create full equality. ठीक है. Then there is another similarity and difference. Both of them, they agreed that humans are rational. Both of them agreed that humans are rational. But clearly, the definition of rationality was different for both of them. So, for Malthus, what was rationality? Rationality for Malthus was for humans to see that there is limits to growth. Rationality for Malthus was for the humans to see that there is limits to growth. And humans cannot overpower nature. Cannot overpower nature. On the other hand, for Marx, he had a more possibilistic outlook and believed in the intellectual capacity of humans to extend indefinitely extend and improve his productive powers and improve his productive powers, thus making the need for population control irrelevant. Thus making the need for population control irrelevant. Okay. Then, if you talk about both of them, what they did, they focused on the concept of struggle, focused upon the concept of struggle. But clearly, here also there were differences. If you talk about Malthus, the struggle was existence, for existence. And this struggle for existence was between whom and whom? It was between human and nature. Human and nature. On the other hand, if you talk about Marx, for him, what was struggle? It was class struggle. He also recognizes a struggle, but he recognizes the case of class struggle. Okay? So that is another thing. Then, if you talk about both of them, here you can say both of them were fifth point होगा ना ये? Both of them were determinists. Both of them were determinist in their outlook. जैसा पहले हमने बोला, on the one case, Malthus, if you talk about, he was very clearly environmental determinist. Determinist. On the other hand, as we said, Marx, he was more of a economic determinist. Then both of them saw human as a special creature. Special creature. But for Malthus, if you talk about, this specialness was more of spiritual. स्पिरिचुअल। जब हम ह्यूमनिज्म पढ़ेंगे तो उसमें देखेंगे देयर इज अ कंसेप्ट ऑफ मेटाफिजिकल ह्यूमनिज्म, एंड दिस कंसेप्ट बिलीव्स दैट human beings were created specially by God. So God took a holiday of 2 weeks and decided कि कुछ बढ़िया बनाते हैं, and he came up with the human beings, and thus human beings are special, they are above all the creatures. So his, if you talk about this special creature, was more of a spiritual type. On the other hand, Marx, if you talk about, for Marx, he saw it, this speciality, from the concept of materialism. Materialism. So human beings have become special through what? Through their history and development of productive powers. Development of productive powers. Okay. So this was another. Then coming to the concept of poverty. So both of them have recognized the prevalence of poverty. Poverty. But when it comes to poverty, if you talk about Malthus, Malthus defined poverty in terms of principles of population. In terms of principles of population. Population. And you know, it was outcome of what? It was outcome of the geometric progression versus arithmetic progression. So that was the way in which poverty arose. Okay. Marx defined poverty in a different way. He defines poverty as a class problem. As a class problem. And it was outcome of what? It was outcome of exploitation. Exploitation. Which in turn was result of what? Unequal distribution of resources. Which in turn was result of unequal distribution of resources. ठीक है, इसी कंटेक्स्ट में एक और पॉइंट लिख सकते हैं. बोथ ऑफ देम agreed on the definition of misery. Both of them have talked about misery. But for Malthus, misery कौन सी थी? It was considered as famine, pestilence, diseases, vice, etc. But if you talk about Marx, for him, misery was mainly exploitation. It was mainly exploitation and outcomes of these exploitation. This class exploitation. Now, when it comes to misery, another thing we can write, both of them agreed that what will happen? Misery increases with time. Increases with time. So, if you talk about, however, in case of Malthus, what happens? This increase ultimately checks population. checks population growth naturally. In case of Marx, it keeps on increasing with time. Increasing with time. So he is very clear that it will not check the population growth. It will, in fact, what it would do, it would increase the population growth. And the solution, if you talk about, दस अलग से भी लिख सकते हो या फिर उसमें उसी पॉइंट में लिख सकते हो. Solution to the problems of overpopulation and misery, both of them have talked about this, but they are very clearly what different. So Malthus, it is the case of positive checks. Positive checks. Then if you talk about Marx, it is which type? It is revolution. It is revolution. Similarly, if you talk about definition of optimum population, optimum population. So both of them have talked about that it would be existing. There will be a time when there will be optimum population. But tell me, can we say ki when we are talking about Malthus, in case of Malthus, so this is the resource growth and this is the population growth. So tell me, in case of Malthus, there is a point where there is this point O, where there is optimum population, when the growth rates are same or same amount of resources are available as the population is. So in case of Malthus, optimum population is what? It is a temporary stage. For Malthus, it is a temporary stage. But when it comes to Marx, Marx believes that it is what? It becomes permanent. Permanent. In what it becomes permanent? If you adopt a communist mode of production. ठीक है. So देखो, अभी मैं और भी पॉइंट्स निकाल सकता हूं उससे. What was the basic idea कि हमने जिस तरह से इंट्रोडक्शन लिखा, सेम वे व्हाट वी डिड, वी रोट द एंटायर मेन बॉडी, जहां पर हमने ये दिखाने की कोशिश की कि they were trying to solve the same problems, thus they seem to be closer, but in each aspect how far apart essentially they were. And it mainly arises because of what? Because of their totally different philosophical basis. ठीक है. So both the ways you can use. मुझे लगता है कि सेकंड में एक एडवांटेज मिलेगा, एक दो नंबर का जो भी मिले, but there will be definitely an advantage you will get.